The wagon was already rolling when Beau Calloway came thundering across the ridge, his horse kicking up a storm of red dust that hung in the October air like a wound that refused to close. "Stella." His voice cracked the silence of the prairie like a rifle shot, raw and unsteady in a way that would have surprised every man who had ever worked for him. "Stella Aldridge, you stop that wagon right now." She did not stop the wagon. She sat rigid on the bench seat with the reins threaded through her gloved fingers, her jaw set, and her eyes fixed straight ahead on the road that wound south toward the Harlan County line. Beside her, old Martha Gibbs from the dry goods store kept her mouth shut and her eyes forward too, because Martha had lived long enough in this territory to know when a woman's silence was the most dangerous kind of fury there was. Beau pulled his horse, a big black gelding named Ransom, alongside the wagon at a hard canter. His hat was gone somewhere. His dark hair was wild from the ride. There was a cut on his jaw from where he had clearly not taken time to be careful about anything this morning, and his shirt was buttoned wrong, 2 buttons off from the collar down, as though he had dressed in the dark or in a desperate hurry or both. "You cannot leave," he said, pushing Ransom closer to the wagon wheel. "Not like this. Not without letting me explain." "You had your chance to explain," Stella said, and her voice was so quiet and so steady that it was somehow worse than shouting. "You had about 10 chances to explain, Beau. I stopped counting after the 7th. Stella, what you saw in that office." "What I saw," she said, turning to look at him for the first time, and he almost flinched at what was in her eyes, not rage, but something colder, something that looked like the final, irreversible closing of a door, was enough. She snapped the reins and the 2 draft horses pulled harder. The wagon creaked and lurched forward over a rut in the road, and Beau had to swerve Ransom to keep from being clipped by the back corner of it. He pulled up at the top of a small rise and watched the wagon descend toward the creek crossing below, watched the woman he had spent the last 18 months falling completely and helplessly in love with ride out of Harlan County, without looking back once. He stood there in the cold morning for a long moment. The wind moved through the yellow grass around him. Somewhere behind him, 300 head of cattle needed his attention. 2 ranch hands were waiting on his orders, and a fence line on the north pasture had been down since Tuesday. None of it mattered in the slightest. He turned Ransom south and followed her. It had started the way most things worth having in this life started, slowly and without warning, with nothing more dramatic than a woman walking into his feed store to argue about the price of alfalfa. The year was 1882. And the town of Caldwell's Creek in Harlan County, Kansas, was the kind of place that had just barely survived its own wildness and was now working hard to become something more respectable. There was a bank, a school, a church with a bell that actually worked, and a marshal who had only shot 2 men in the last calendar year, both of them with considerable justification. The cattle trade was the blood of the place, and everyone who lived there understood that the men who ran the big ranches were the ones whose opinions shaped the town. Beau Calloway was 28 years old and had been running the Calloway Ranch since his father died 3 years prior. The ranch sat on 4,000 acres of good grassland north of town, ran about 400 head of mixed longhorn and shorthorn cattle, employed 6 permanent hands, and represented the accumulated effort of 30 years of his family's labor in this country. He was not a bad man. He was not a cruel man, but he was, by the universal consensus of everyone who knew him, a profoundly stubborn man. His father had been the same way. His grandfather too, apparently, though Beau had only his mother's stories to go on there. The stubbornness had served him well in some ways. It made him relentless, when a problem needed solving, and immovable when someone tried to take advantage of him. It also made him slow to apologize, quick to dig in when he felt cornered, and occasionally blind to the full weight of what his silence cost other people. Stella Aldridge had arrived in Caldwell's Creek in late April of that year, which was 1882, coming from Wichita with a wagon load of her own belongings and a land deed to 60 acres east of town that her late uncle had left her. She was 25 years old, had spent the last 2 years working as a seamstress and taking in laundry to save money after the business she had briefly tried to establish in Wichita had failed, and she had absolutely no intention of depending on anyone else's charity or goodwill to build what she was going to build on those 60 acres. What she was going to build was a small farm that would also serve as a working kitchen garden and herb supply operation, selling fresh vegetables, dried herbs, and eventually fruit from the apple and pear trees she intended to plant, to the hotels and restaurants and households of Caldwell's Creek. It was a sensible plan. It was well thought out. It accounted for the soil quality, the water access, the existing market, and her own labor capacity. The first obstacle was that the 60 acres were mostly overgrown with years of neglect. The small cabin on the property needed significant repair, and the only nearby source for the heavy alfalfa seed she would need to stabilize the back portion of the property was Callaway's Feed and Supply, which was technically part of the ranch operation, but also served the public. She walked in on a Wednesday morning in early May, asked about alfalfa seed prices, and was told by the young man behind the counter, whose name was Pete Hargrove, that the price was 14 cents a pound. She said that was 11 cents too many, and asked to speak to whoever was in charge. Bo had been in the back doing inventory. He came out with a pencil still tucked behind his ear and sawdust on his forearms, and he looked at the woman standing at his counter, and something in his chest did an uncomfortable thing that he immediately attributed to the fact that he had skipped breakfast. "Mr. Callaway," Stella Aldridge said, and she looked straight at him in the direct, unapologetic way she had that some men found disconcerting and that Bo found immediately and unexpectedly interesting. "I understand your alfalfa seed is 14 cents a pound. I would like to buy 200 pounds, and I would like to pay 3 cents a pound." "Then you are going to be disappointed," he said. "I am going to be a regular customer," she said, "because I intend to be farming that 60-acre plot east of town for the foreseeable future, and I will need seed and supplies and various other things on a consistent basis. 14 cents is a price for someone who comes in once. 3 cents is a price for someone who comes in every season." He looked at her for a moment. She looked back. The pencil behind his ear was suddenly the most awkward thing in the world. 6 cents, he said. 4, she said. 5, he said. "And that is final. And it is still below my standard pricing, and if you tell anyone I gave you that rate, I will deny it categorically." She did not exactly smile, but something shifted in her expression that was in the general neighborhood of satisfaction. 5 cents a pound, paid in full at time of purchase. I will be back in 3 weeks for more if the germination rate is what it should be. She paid for the seed, loaded it into her wagon herself, declined Pete Hargrove's offer to help with a polite but firm thank you, and drove away. Bo stood at the door of the feed store and watched her go, and continued attributing everything he was feeling to the breakfast he had not eaten. She came back in 3 weeks. The germination rate had been excellent. She bought more seed at 5 cents a pound and asked, while she was there, whether he knew of anyone looking for laundry work, as she was trying to build up enough working capital to purchase a second-hand plow from the smithy. He said he did not, which was true. He also said, before he fully thought about whether it was a sensible thing to say, that if she needed a plow, the ranch had one it was not currently using, and she was welcome to borrow it for the season. She looked at him the way she looked at things she was trying to calculate the actual cost of. "What would that borrow cost me?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "My neighbor borrows tools from me. I borrow tools from my neighbor. It is how things work out here. I am not your neighbor. You are 60 acres east of town. I am 4,000 acres north of town. In Harlan County, that is practically next door." She borrowed the plow. She returned it 6 weeks later in better condition than she had received it, cleaned and oiled, and with a cracked handle he had not even noticed replaced with a new one she had clearly had the smithy make. He thought about that for longer than made any practical sense. Over the course of that summer and into the fall, a pattern developed. She would come to the feed store every few weeks for supplies. He would, with no particular plan or intention, find reasons to be present when she arrived. They would argue about prices, and then arrive at a compromise. They would talk, briefly at first and then for longer stretches, about the land, about the cattle market, about the weather, about the things the town council was doing wrong, about the things she was growing and what she intended to do with them. He told her about the ranch, about the years after his father died when he had nearly lost it to a combination of debt and drought and his own inexperience, about the 2 younger sisters he had sent to school in Topeka, and who were the main reason he worked as hard as he did, about the dark past of a season 3 years ago, when he had been close to selling everything and walking away from it all. By October, they were having dinner together at the hotel on Friday evenings, which everyone in Caldwell's Creek noticed and commented on, and which both of them declined to classify as anything in particular. By December, he was kissing her at the door of her cabin after the Christmas social at the church hall, and the snow was falling in the soft, quiet way it sometimes did on the plains, and she looked up at him afterward with those clear, serious eyes and said, "I want you to know that I am not a woman who does things halfway, Bo Calloway. So if this is something you are doing halfway, you should tell me now." "I have never done anything halfway in my life," he said, which was true, and which he meant in the best possible way. "Then we understand each other," she said, and went inside. He walked home through the snow with his heart doing something he had no vocabulary for, and did not try to name. The winter was the best winter he could remember. She would come to the ranch on Sundays, and he would ride out to her place on Wednesday evenings after the work was done, and they would sit by her fire and talk about everything, about her plans for the spring planting, about the politics of the cattle market, about books she had read, about the things they both believed about work and honesty and the kind of life worth building. He had never in his life talked to anyone the way he talked to her. It was not a thing he had expected. He had expected, vaguely, to eventually marry some sensible rancher's daughter and build a partnership that was based on practical compatibility and mutual respect, which were things he valued. What he had not expected was someone who made him feel, in the deep and complicated center of himself, genuinely understood. She was not easy. She was direct to the point of bluntness, relentlessly independent in ways that occasionally frustrated him, and she had a memory like a vault when it came to anything she felt had been a slight or an unfairness. She was also funny, which surprised him, in a dry and quiet way that caught him off guard and made him laugh at moments he had not seen coming. She was brave in the matter-of-fact kind of way, not dramatic about it, just consistently present in the face of difficulty without flinching. He loved her. He understood that it was love by late February, when she was sick with a chest cold for 2 weeks, and he rode out to her place every single day to bring supplies and check on her, and sat by her bed and read to her, when she was too tired to hold a book, and realized at some point during the second week that he would do this forever if she let him, that this was not a feeling he could imagine being without. He had not told her yet. The stubbornness worked against him here. There was a part of him that was waiting for the moment to be right, for everything to be settled and certain, for some internal signal that he could not quite define, and that waiting would cost him more than he understood. The spring of 1883 came in hard and complicated. The complication arrived in the form of Gerald Weston, who rode into Caldwell's Creek in late March with money to spend, and a plan to buy up as much land in the eastern part of Harlan County as he could acquire. Weston was 40 years old, from St. Louis originally, and he represented a consortium of investors who had decided that the cattle and grain trade in central Kansas was about to expand dramatically, with the new rail spur being planned through the county, and who wanted to position themselves to profit from that expansion. Bo had met Weston before, briefly, at a cattle buyers' meeting in Wichita the previous fall. He had not liked him, for reasons that were partly about business and partly about the way Weston talked to people, which was with the smooth and effortless friendliness of someone who was always calculating what the person in front of him was worth. Weston came to see Bo within the first week of his arrival in town. He sat in the chair across from Bo's desk in the ranch office and laid out a proposal for a land and cattle partnership that was, on its face, a reasonable business arrangement. Weston's consortium would provide capital investment. Bo would provide land, expertise, and operational management. Profits would be split at a ratio that Weston described as generous. The hidden motive was not difficult to detect if you were paying attention. Weston did not want a partnership in any real sense. He wanted control, and the capital and the contract terms were the trap through which that control would eventually be achieved. Bo had seen similar arrangements before and knew better than to walk into one. He turned Weston down, politely but clearly, at the end of that first meeting. What he did not know, and what Weston had apparently calculated very carefully, was that Stella's 60 acres sat directly in the path of the proposed rail spur, which meant that if Weston's consortium could acquire her land, or adjacent land, the value and leverage of their whole position in the county changed significantly. Weston began calling on Stella in early April. Bo found out about it from Pete Hargrove, who mentioned it in passing while they were going over supply orders, noting that the fellow from St. Louis had been out to Miss Aldridge's place a couple of times and seemed real interested in her operation. The jealousy that moved through Bo at that moment was both immediate and intensely uncomfortable, and the way he handled it was, in retrospect, the first in a chain of mistakes. Instead of talking to Stella about it directly, instead of telling her what he knew about Weston and his methods and his hidden motives, instead of simply being honest about the fact that he did not trust the man, and that he was worried, Bo said nothing. He told himself it was because he did not want to seem like he was telling her what to do with her own business, because she was fiercely independent, and he respected that, because it was not his place to manage her affairs. The real reason, the one he could not quite look at directly, was that saying anything would require him to explain exactly how much he cared about what happened to her, to use words and make explicit what he had been feeling for months without ever fully naming it aloud, and that felt like a kind of vulnerability he was not ready for. So he waited, and he watched, and he said nothing. Weston was charming in the deliberate, practiced way of men who made charm into a tool. He brought gifts to Stella, not extravagant ones but thoughtful ones. A new pair of work gloves that were the right size for a woman's hands, a copy of a seed catalog from a Chicago company that had varieties she had been trying to find. He talked to her about her plans with what seemed like genuine interest. He made offers for her land that were fair on the surface and that any reasonable person would consider seriously. Stella was not naive. She had been burned once before by a hidden motive, and she was careful. But she was also practical, and the money Weston was offering for her 60 acres was more than she had made in 2 years of hard work, and she was listening to the offer the way a sensible businesswoman listened, weighing it, examining it from multiple angles, not deciding but not dismissing. What she wanted, what she had actually wanted since the first serious conversation she and Beau had about the future in January, was for Beau to give her one good reason to stay put in Harlan County, rather than take a significant sum of money and use it to start fresh somewhere else. Somewhere bigger, somewhere with more market access, somewhere she had not spent the last year fighting the soil into productivity through sheer force of will and early mornings. The one good reason she was waiting for was the one he had not yet found the words to give her. In late April, Beau found out through his ranch foreman, who had it from the county clerk's assistant, who had overheard a conversation at the barber shop, that Weston had entered into a private agreement with the 2 landowners adjacent to Stella's property, acquiring their parcels, and that he was now in a position where Stella's 60 acres was the last piece he needed for his plan to work. He also found out on the same day that Weston had invited Stella to dinner at the hotel that Friday evening. Friday evening was when Beau and Stella had dinner together at the hotel. He rode to her place that Thursday evening, intending to finally say what he needed to say, to lay everything out, the land scheme, the trap Weston was building, the thing that had been living in his chest since February, all of it. He found her in the garden as the sun was going down, her hands dirty and her hair coming loose from its pins the way it did when she had been working for hours. And she looked up at him when he dismounted, and she was smiling, the particular quiet smile she had when things were going well with the plants, and he opened his mouth to say everything he had ridden over to say. What came out instead was, "I heard you are having dinner with Weston tomorrow." Her smile faded. The careful, measuring look replaced it. "Where did you hear that?" "It is a small town," he said. "It is," she agreed. "Are you asking me not to?" This was the moment. He could see it clearly, even in the moment. This was the precise point at which the right thing to say was yes. "I am asking you not to, because I love you and I want you to have dinner with me on Friday like we always do, and because Weston is not what he appears to be, and because I need you to know that staying here is worth it." What he said was, "I am not your keeper." The words came out cold and clipped, which was what happened when he was feeling something too large to manage and defaulted to the hard outer shell that had protected him since he was 25 years old and fighting to hold his father's ranch together. She looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said, "you are not." She had dinner with Weston on Friday. Beau ate alone at the ranch and told himself it did not matter. It mattered enormously. May was miserable. The comfortable ease between them fractured. They were still polite. They were still, technically, whatever they had been before. But there was a distance now that had not been there, a watchfulness, a mutual tension that neither of them addressed directly because neither of them had yet developed the exact tools required to do so. Weston continued to call on Stella. He continued to make his case for the land. He was patient and consistent, which was one of the things that made him effective at what he did. Beau knew that Weston's patience was not genuine, that there was a deadline he was working toward related to the rail spur planning, that the trap would close whether or not Stella saw it coming. He knew he needed to tell her. He sat with the knowledge and did not act on it, paralyzed by the same stubbornness that had served him so well in every other area of his life. The crisis came at the beginning of September in his ranch office, on a Tuesday afternoon. Bo had arranged a meeting with Weston, intending finally to confront the man directly, to lay out what he knew about the land scheme, and make clear that he was going to make sure every landowner in the county understood what Weston's consortium actually intended. It was a blunt strategy, but it was the one he had landed on. Weston arrived at the office at 2 in the afternoon. What Bo did not know was that Stella, who had come to the feed store to settle a supply account and had noticed Ransom tied outside the ranch office, had followed the path from the store to the office out of the natural curiosity she had about anything that involved the operations of the property she had become closely associated with over the past year. She opened the office door to find Bo and Weston standing across from each other at the desk, with a set of papers spread between them. She could not hear what had been said before she arrived. What she could see was the papers on the desk. What she could read, in the 3 seconds before Bo looked up and saw her, was enough of the heading to understand that these were documents related to a land transaction. What she could see was Weston's signature already on one page. What she could not see, because she could not hear the full context of what was happening, was that Bo had spent the last 20 minutes refusing to sign, that the papers were there because Weston had brought them as part of his pitch, and not because Bo had agreed to anything, that Bo was in the process of telling Weston in language that was increasingly direct that no transaction of this kind was going to happen. What it looked like, from the doorway, with no context, and with the long accumulation of a summer's worth of distance and unspoken things and nights wondering whether Bo actually valued her the way she needed to be valued, was that Bo Calloway was in business with the man who had been trying to buy her out. That the whole summer, while she had been trying to understand whether she had a reason to stay in Harlan County, the man she had spent the winter falling in love with had been involved in the very scheme that was pressuring her to leave. It looked like betrayal. It looked like the exact, precise kind of betrayal that had happened to her before, the hidden motive, the smile and the warmth on the surface while something entirely different was being arranged underneath. She closed the door before Bo could get a word out. He found her 20 minutes later, back at the feed store, settling her account with a calmness that was the most frightening thing he had ever seen. He tried to explain. The explanation came out badly, which was what happened when he was panicked and defensive at the same time, because instead of starting with the truth simply and clearly, he started with justifications, which sounded like excuses, which confirmed rather than contradicted what she feared. She paid her account, said good afternoon to Pete Hargrove, and walked to her wagon. He tried again at the wagon. She said very clearly that she needed him to stop talking, that she needed to think, that she would speak to him when she was ready to speak to him. He said, which was the worst thing he had said yet, "This is exactly why I did not tell you earlier, because you make up your mind about things before you have all the facts." The silence that followed was absolute and devastating. She drove away. He did not ride after her that evening. He told himself she needed space. He told himself she would come around when she had thought it through. He told himself a number of things that were all versions of the same fundamental failure to simply, immediately, go to her and say plainly and without pride or defensiveness, "I love you. I was wrong to keep this from you. Here is the whole truth. I am sorry." The next morning, at first light, she was loading her wagon outside her cabin with everything that mattered to her. Martha Gibbs from the dry goods store was there with a wagon of her own. It turned out that Martha's sister lived in Carlson County, 2 hours south, and Martha had been meaning to visit. And when Stella had come by the evening before asking whether anyone was heading south in the morning, Martha had offered to share the road. That was how they had come to be driving south on the Carlson County road, when Bo came over the ridge on ransom. He sat there for about 30 seconds. Then he rode after her. The Harlan County line was about 12 miles south of Caldwell's Creek on the main road, and Martha's sister lived another 8 miles past that in a town called Grover's Mill that had grown up around a grain elevator and a stagecoach stop. 20 miles total. Bo had left with nothing. No pack, no bedroll, no change of clothes, no plan beyond the single driving necessity of getting to Stella before she had gone far enough that coming back felt impossible. He caught up to the wagons at the creek crossing. The water was low enough in early October to ford without difficulty, but Martha's wagon was older and she was taking it slowly, and he pulled Ransom alongside Stella's wagon just as the front wheels hit the water. "I need you to let me speak," he said. "That is all I am asking. One conversation." She kept her eyes on the ford. "You had 10 chances to speak, Bo. I counted them. I know. And each time you chose to say nothing or to say the wrong thing. I know that too." The wagons moved slowly through the shallow water. Martha, in the lead wagon, was very carefully looking at something on the opposite bank. "I was not in business with Weston," he said. "Those papers you saw were his. I had been refusing to sign them for 20 minutes. I was telling him, when you walked in, that I was going to make sure every landowner in the county knew what his consortium's real intention was." Something moved through her expression, not softness, not yet, but a kind of careful attention. "What I was doing in that office," he continued, "was trying to protect your 60 acres in the only way I knew how to do it, which was by confronting him directly. Which is also why it took me too long, because I kept thinking I could solve it without making it your problem, without making you feel like I was interfering in your affairs." "That is not protecting me," she said. "That is managing me." "Yes," he said. "I understand that now." The horses finished the ford. Both wagons climbed the low bank on the far side and stopped on the flat ground beyond. Martha climbed down from her wagon to check a wheel that had been rattling. Stella sat with the reins in her hands and looked straight ahead. "I have been trying to find the right moment to tell you something since February," Bo said. His voice had lost the defensive edge it so often had when he was under pressure, and what was under it was something raw and unguarded. "And every time I got close to it, I found a reason to wait. Because the thing I needed to say was large enough that saying it incorrectly felt worse than not saying it at all, which is, I can see now, exactly backward." She turned and looked at him. He met her eyes. The October light was thin and gold and it fell across her face, and he thought that he had been an extraordinary fool. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since sometime around the second week in February, when you were sick with that chest cold, and I was reading to you, and I realized I would do that for the rest of my life if you allowed it. I should have told you in March. I should have told you in April, instead of saying I was not your keeper, which was the most cowardly thing I have ever said to anyone. I should have told you last night instead of going home and telling myself you needed space. I should have been telling you since February." Stella was very still. "None of that explains why you hid things from me," she said, but her voice was different now. "No. I hid things because I am stubborn in ways I am not always aware of in the moment, because I was trying to handle a problem for you without involving you, which is a pattern I have and which comes from years of handling everything alone and from a failure to understand that involving you is not a burden. It is how things between people who love each other are supposed to work." He paused. "I understand that now. I did not understand it fully before. I do now, and I am sorry. I am completely and genuinely sorry, Stella, and I will tell you that as many times as it takes, but I am going to need you to tell me it is eventually going to be enough." Martha was done checking her wheel. She climbed back onto her wagon without looking at either of them. Stella was quiet for a long time. "You followed me all the way to the county line," she said finally. "I would have followed you to Wichita," he said. "I would have followed you to Missouri if it came to that." Something in her face changed entirely. The careful, closed expression that had been there since yesterday morning shifted, and what was underneath it was tired and uncertain and also, unmistakably, the same thing that had been in his chest since February. "I have 60 acres," she said, "and 3 years of work in that soil. I know. I am not selling to Weston. Good. I am not merging with your ranch operation either. I run my own business. I would not have it any other way." She looked at him for a moment longer. "You are still an infuriating man." "Yes," he agreed. "I am working on it." "You are going to have to work very hard on it. I know." She took one breath. Then she said quietly, "Get down off that horse." He dismounted. She set the brake on the wagon and climbed down from the bench seat, and he was there to steady her as she came down, his hands at her waist. And then she was standing on the ground in front of him, and she looked up at him the way she had at the door of her cabin in the December snow, direct and certain, and with something in it that was the most important thing he had ever been the subject of. "You are going to have to learn to talk to me," she said, "I know, about everything. Not after you have decided what to do about it when it is happening." "Yes. And you are going to tell me right now exactly what you know about Weston's plan, all of it, every detail, so that I can decide what to do about my own 60 acres. "All right," he said. "And then," she said, and she took hold of the front of his badly buttoned shirt with one hand, "you are going to take me home." He told her everything he knew about Weston. Standing on the south side of the creek crossing in Harlan County, with Martha Gibbs sitting in her wagon 20 feet away pretending to be absorbed in checking the cargo ties. He told her about the rail spur, the adjacent land acquisitions, the timeline, the consortium's actual intentions, the trap that had been being built around her all spring and summer. He told her all of it. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long have you known about the rail spur?" "Since April." "April," she said. "Yes. You knew since April that my land was the centerpiece of his plan, and you said nothing to me." "I said nothing to you," he confirmed. "Why?" "Because I was going to handle it." "Bo." "I know." She pressed her lips together and looked at the flat horizon for a moment. "You are going to have a very long winter of earning this back. I understand." "Good." She released his shirt. She turned to Martha. "Martha, I am going home. Thank you for the company this morning." Martha Gibbs said, without turning around from her cargo ties, that it had been a real pleasure and that she hoped the rest of the day went well for all concerned. The ride back to Caldwell's Creek took 2 hours, Stella in the wagon and Bo on Ransom beside her for the first mile. And then she pulled the wagon over on a flat stretch of road and told him to tie Ransom to the back and ride the bench with her, because she was not going to spend 2 hours talking to a man sitting 6 feet above her on horseback. He tied Ransom to the back and rode the bench. They talked for 2 hours. Real talk, the kind they had been circling around since spring, the kind where he said things he had not said before, and she told him things she had held back. She told him that the summer had been the loneliest she could remember, that she had genuinely considered selling to Weston not because she wanted the money, but because she had started to wonder whether Bo's silence meant she had misunderstood what they were to each other. She told him that the hardest part of what she had seen in his office was not the suspicion that he was in business with Weston, but the confirmation, as it had felt to her, of a pattern she had been dreading, the hidden motive, the separate plan, the smile on the surface and the business under the table, the same thing that had happened in Wichita. He listened. He did not interrupt and he did not become defensive, which cost him something but which he understood was what was needed. When she was finished, he said, "I am not that man, and I would rather spend the rest of my life proving that than spend another season assuming you already know it." She considered that. "Then start proving it. I intend to." When they arrived back in Caldwell's Creek, the first thing Bo did was go to the county clerk's office and formally request all available documentation on the rail spur planning and the land transaction filings Weston's consortium had made. He did this with Stella beside him, which was noted by everyone in the clerk's office and which would be the topic of conversation at both the barber shop and the dry goods store before evening. What the documentation revealed was both illuminating and useful. Weston's consortium had filed letters of intent with 2 adjacent landowners, but neither sale had closed. The rail spur itself was still in planning phases, and the route had not been officially confirmed, which meant the entire scheme was built on projected value rather than certain value, which was much more fragile than Weston had represented. Bo laid this out for Stella at her kitchen table that evening, the document spread between them and 2 cups of coffee going cold at the edges of the papers, and she studied everything with the focused, methodical attention she brought to any problem that needed to be solved. "His leverage depends on securing all 3 parcels before the route is confirmed," she said. "If even one of the adjacent landowners backs out, his position collapses." "Yes, and those sales have not closed." "Not yet." She looked at him across the table. "You know both of those men." "I know one of them well. Jim Hartley, North Parcel. His daughter married my hand Tom Oakes 2 years ago. He would listen to me." "Then we should talk to him," she said, and the "we" was deliberate, and Bo heard it and felt the weight of it in a way that made his chest do the thing it had been doing since February. "Yes," he said, "we should." They went to see Jim Hartley the following morning. It was a careful conversation, requiring Bo to lay out what he knew about Weston's methods and the real nature of the consortium's plans, without making promises he could not keep, and without pressuring Hartley toward a decision that was his to make. Stella sat in Jim Hartley's kitchen and listened, and then, when Bo had finished, she explained her own situation with the 60 acres and the rail spur projection in clear, practical terms. And then she said, quietly, that she thought Jim Hartley was a man who took the time to understand what he was agreeing to before he agreed to it. Jim Hartley was quiet for a long time after that. He looked at his coffee. He looked at Bo. He looked at Stella. He said he had been uneasy about the deal since it was offered, and that there were things in the contract language he had not fully followed, and that he had been meaning to have it looked at by someone with a legal background before anything was signed. Bo said that was a sound instinct. Hartley did not sign with Weston's consortium. The South Parcel owner, a man named Dave Corey, who Bo did not know well, had already signed a preliminary agreement. But when the rail spur route was officially announced 3 weeks later, it ran a quarter-mile east of where Weston had projected, which put it entirely off Stella's 60 acres and made the whole complicated land scheme effectively worthless. Weston left Caldwell's Creek in late October, quietly, without ceremony, taking his consortium plans with him. The season turned. The cottonwoods along the creek went yellow, and the mornings came in cold, and the cattle in the north pasture grew thick in their winter coats. Bo fixed the fence line on the north pasture, the one that had been down since Tuesday the morning he had left everything to follow Stella south. He fixed it 3 days late, but he fixed it. He and Stella fell back into their rhythm, but it was a different rhythm now, fuller and more honest, and built on something more solid than the pleasant but incomplete foundation they had been working on before. He came to her place on Wednesday evenings and stayed longer, sometimes past 9, and they would sit by the fire and talk and sometimes not talk, just comfortable in the silence in the way that only happens between people who are genuinely at ease with each other. She came to the ranch on Sundays as she had before, but now she came in the mornings and stayed through the afternoon, walking the land with him, understanding the operation the way a person understands something they consider their own. He told her in November that he wanted to marry her. He did not do it with any elaborate performance, because she was not a woman who valued elaborate performance. He did it at her kitchen table, over the same cold coffee that seemed to be a recurring feature of their most important conversations. And he said, simply and directly, that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her, that he wanted her 60 acres and his 4,000 acres and everything they could build between them, and that he was asking her, plainly and without conditions or hidden motives, to marry him. She looked at him for a long moment. "You understand," she said, "that the 60 acres stays mine, completely and without question, and that I run my farm operation independently, absolutely, and that when you have a problem that involves me, you talk to me about it instead of deciding to handle it on my behalf. I am committed to this." She looked at him a moment longer. "Yes," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him, and turned her hand over and held his back, and neither of them said anything else for a while. They married in January of 1884, in the church with the working bell, in a ceremony that was simple and attended by most of the town, because Caldwell's Creek was the kind of place where everyone had been watching this particular situation develop for 2 years and had feelings about it. Beau's 2 sisters came up from Topeka for it, which delighted Stella, who had heard about them for a year and who found them immediately wonderful. His ranch foreman, a steady man named Cal Briggs, stood up with Beau. Martha Gibbs sat in the second row and cried in a satisfied way. Stella wore a dress she had made herself, in a dark blue wool that was practical for January, and that suited her exactly. Beau wore the good suit he had bought in Wichita 2 years ago and had worn exactly once, to a cattle association dinner, and he stood at the front of the church and watched her walk up the aisle and felt something so large in his chest that he was briefly concerned about his structural integrity. The minister asked whether he took this woman, and he said yes before the sentence was finished, which got a quiet laugh from the pews. She said her vows in the clear, direct voice she had for things she meant completely, looking at him the whole time, and he thought it was the bravest and most straightforward thing he had ever witnessed anyone do. They moved into the ranch house together, which was large enough for both of them and for the eventual family they had spoken about wanting, and she brought her things from the cabin on the 60 acres, which she kept and continued to work, riding out there 3 mornings a week as the growing season approached. The cabin became the operational center of her farm business, where she stored supplies and dried herbs and kept records. The ranch house became home. The spring of 1884 was a good spring. The alfalfa on the 60 acres came in thick and well. The kitchen garden expanded to twice its previous size, and Stella had made arrangements with 3 of the hotels in the county and the new restaurant in Caldwell's Creek to be a regular supplier of fresh and dried produce, which gave her operation a stability it had not had before. The ranch had a good calf crop, the cattle prices held strong, and Beau managed to hire a 4th permanent hand to take on some of the fence work that had been consuming too much of his personal time. He also learned, gradually and with sustained effort, to talk to her about things when they were happening rather than when he had already decided what to do about them. This was not a natural or easy skill for him. There were still moments when his instinct was to take a problem to himself and solve it before bringing it to her attention. And there were moments when she had to say, pointedly, "Bo, what is happening with the North Pasture water situation?" And he would say, "I was going to tell you," and she would say, "You were going to tell me after you had already decided." And he would admit that she was right, and they would talk about it. He got better at it. Not perfect, but consistently better, which was all she had ever asked for. In October of 1884, which was almost exactly a year from the morning he had followed her down the Harlan County road, Stella told him she was pregnant. She told him at the kitchen table, with the good autumn light coming through the window and a pot of something on the stove filling the house with the smell of the bay leaves she grew in the kitchen garden. And she told him directly, in the way she told him everything important. He sat with it for a moment. She watched him carefully. Then he stood up from the table and came around to her side of it, and gathered her into his arms with the care of someone handling something they understand to be very precious. And she put her arms around him and let him, and he held her for a long time without saying anything. When he did speak, he said, into her hair, "I did not know it was possible to be this happy and this terrified at the same time." She laughed, which was the best sound in the world. "Welcome to most things worth doing," she said. Their son was born in June of 1885. They named him James, after her father, who had been a schoolteacher in Missouri, and who had, in Stella's telling, been the kind of man who made you believe that knowing things was worth the trouble of learning them. James Calloway was a large, healthy, extremely opinionated infant who made his feelings about most situations very clear from the beginning, which Bo found entirely recognizable. Stella was extraordinary about the whole business of new motherhood, which surprised neither of them, since she was extraordinary about most things she decided to do. She was tired in the way anyone was tired with a new baby, but she was also deeply, quietly content in a way that Bo noticed, and that moved him. She had told him once, early in their courtship, that she was not sure she had ever fully belonged somewhere, that the Missouri house had stopped being home after her mother died, and she had never fully settled since. He had never forgotten that. He watched her in the ranch house with their son, and the herb bundles hanging from the kitchen ceiling and the vegetable catalog on the side table, and the dog that had appeared on the front step in March, and had been named Thomas Jefferson by someone and never left, and he thought that she had found it. The belonging. He had helped build it for her. That seemed to him one of the best things he had ever done. James was 9 months old when Stella told Bo that 2 of the neighboring farmers had come to her with a proposal. They had noticed that her kitchen garden operation was producing more reliable quality than anything else in the area, and they wanted to know whether she would be willing to consult on their own operations, help them figure out soil management and seed selection and crop rotation, in exchange for a share of the improvement in yield. She told Bo about this over supper, with James in the wooden high chair Bo had made over the winter, and Bo listened to the whole thing and then said, "What do you want to do?" She looked at him with the small, pleased expression she reserved for moments when he got something right. "I want to do it," she said. "It would mean 2 mornings a week off the home property." "That is manageable," he said. "I can cover what needs covering here. You would not mind." "I would be proud," he said. "And also I would never in my life tell you what to do with your time. You used to be less good about that. I have been working on it for 2 years. You have improved significantly." "Thank you," he said, and meant it. The consulting arrangement began the following spring and grew, over the next year, into something that Stella had not quite anticipated, but which made complete sense in retrospect. Other farmers in the area heard about the improvements on the 2 properties where she had consulted, and more requests came in, And what had started as an informal arrangement between neighbors became a small but recognized practice. By 1887, she was consulting regularly on 6 farms in the county and writing occasional pieces for an agricultural journal out of Topeka that had contacted her after someone sent in a letter describing her methods. She remained proud of the 60 acres, which she still worked and which still supplied the hotels and the restaurant. She added to the apple and pear trees she had always planned, planting a small orchard on the eastern boundary of the property in the spring of 1886. She hired a young woman named Ruth Carey to help with the farm work, which meant she could manage the consulting without losing ground on her own operation. Ruth was sharp and interested and good with the plants, and Stella taught her everything she knew with the same directness and generosity that she brought to everything. The ranch continued to thrive. Bo expanded the herd gradually, added a second water source on the north pasture, and built a relationship with a cattle buyer in Kansas City that gave the operation better market access than it had ever had. He hired 2 more permanent hands and built a second bunkhouse to accommodate them. The fence on the north pasture was never down longer than 24 hours after that first Tuesday, because he had made a principle of it. He and Cal Briggs, the foreman, had developed a strong working partnership over the years, built on mutual respect and the kind of trust that comes from working through difficult seasons together. And the ranch ran smoothly enough that Bo had time, now, in a way he had not had in the years of struggle after his father died. Time to ride out to the 60 acres on a Tuesday afternoon and help Stella transplant seedlings. Time to sit in the school meeting and make the case for a second teacher when the enrollment grew too large for one. Time to be at home in the evenings with a frequency that mattered. James grew from an opinionated infant into an opinionated toddler, and then into an opinionated small boy, who had his mother's eyes and his father's determined jaw, and who had opinions about horses at age 3 that were both extremely specific and surprisingly informed. He followed Bo around the ranch with the focused intensity of a child who intends to understand everything, and Bo taught him things patiently and carefully, which was a version of patience he had not known he possessed until James required it. In the spring of 1888, Stella told Bo she was pregnant again. "Are you all right?" she asked, because he had been quiet for longer than usual. "I am better than I have ever been in my life," he said. Their second child was a daughter, born in November of 1888, named Clara, after Bo's mother who had died the previous year, and whose steady, practical courage had been a shaping force of everything Bo had become. Clara was smaller than James had been at birth and more serene, which turned out to be characteristic, as she grew into a child who had Stella's quiet precision and Bo's absolute stubborn certainty once she had decided on something, but who was, in general, the calmer one. James adored her immediately and protectively, which was touching and also occasionally excessive, in the way of older siblings who feel that the younger one requires supervision. The town of Caldwell's Creek grew steadily through the late 1880s. The rail spur that Weston had been scheming around eventually did come through the county, but on the route it had always actually been planned for, which missed the 60 acres entirely, and which added a small depot to the south edge of town, and significantly improved the market access for everyone in the area. Bo's deal with the Kansas City buyer became easier to manage with the rail access. Stella began shipping dried herbs and preserved produce to buyers in Topeka and Wichita through the new connections the depot opened up. Dave Corey, who had signed the preliminary agreement with Weston's consortium and then been left with nothing when the route was confirmed and Weston departed, had spent some difficult years after that. He had lost the preliminary deposit money, which had not been insignificant, and had struggled to make the south parcel work on his own. Bo made a point of directing some business his way over the years, not from obligation but because it was the right thing to do, and because Corey had not been dishonest, only unlucky and insufficiently cautious. By 1889, Corey had turned his parcel around and was running a reasonable cattle operation, and there was no lasting damage between him and anyone else in the county. Jim Hartley, who had backed away from Weston's deal at the right moment, had continued to farm his north parcel with the steady competence that characterized everything he did, and he and his son-in-law Tom Oakes, who still worked for Bo as one of the senior hands, remained on good terms with everyone involved. Bo's two sisters came to visit in the summers when they could, which James and Clara considered events of the highest order. The older sister, Nell, had married a schoolteacher in Topeka and had 2 children of her own, and the visits involved a complicated and joyful management of 4 children across the ranch property that kept all adults occupied. The younger sister, Dot, was still in Topeka, teaching music and showing no particular inclination to marry anyone, which she described as a considered choice, and which Bo had long since accepted was entirely her business. Stella corresponded regularly with her brother Henry in Missouri, the younger of the 2 brothers she had helped raise after their mother died. Henry was farming in the Missouri River Valley and doing well at it, and the letters between them were long and detailed, and full of the particular warmth of people who had grown up through difficulty together, and who valued the connection on the far side of it. Her other brother, Will, had gone further west and was working in Wyoming, and his letters were less frequent but equally valued when they came. In the summer of 1890, Henry visited. Henry said, on his last evening, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, and the sound of James and Clara somewhere inside the house with their mother, that he had worried about Stella for years. That she was the kind of person who took care of everyone else and forgot to arrange for someone to take care of her. That when he had heard she was farming alone on 60 acres in Kansas, he had lain awake more than one night thinking about whether she was all right. Bo listened to this. Henry said, "She is better than all right. She is the best I have seen her since we were small children and our mother was still alive." Bo looked out at the darkening land and thought about the stubbornness that had almost cost him all of this and said, "She did that herself." "I almost got in the way of it." Henry looked at him. "She told me what happened with the man from St. Louis and the land scheme and the morning she left. She told you. She tells me most things eventually. She said you followed her to the county line. I would have followed her further." Henry nodded slowly, the way he did when he was considering something carefully. "I know," he said. "She knows that too. She has always known that." Stella came out onto the porch a few minutes later with 3 fresh cups of coffee, which she distributed, and she sat in the chair beside Bo's, and the evening settled around them in the warm, complete way of evenings that are exactly what they should be. James was 5 years old in the summer of 1890, old enough to be deeply interested in the working parts of the ranch and attached enough to Ransom, who was still going strong at 15, to consider the horse a personal friend. Bo taught him to ride that summer, on a small, tolerant quarter-horse mare named Ada that one of the hands had brought over the previous winter. James took to it with the total commitment he brought to everything, fell off 3 times in the first week, and got back on each time without tears, but with an increasingly focused expression that said the horse was going to understand, who was determined here. Clara, at 1.5, was entirely unimpressed by horses and deeply interested in the herb garden on the 60 acres, where she would sit in the dirt beside Stella's work and handle the plants with a gentleness that was startling in a child so young. Bo watched his children grow and thought about his father, who had built this land from a smaller parcel and a harder start, and who had worked himself down to nothing, keeping it together through the difficult years of the 1870s. He thought about what his father had wanted for him when he had taken over, which was stability and continuation. And he thought about how the continuation had come to mean something larger and richer than his father had probably imagined. He thought about the stubbornness. It had been, over his lifetime, both his best quality and his worst. It had saved the ranch, and it had nearly cost him everything that mattered more than the ranch. He had not cured it. He did not think a man cured something that was threaded all the way through his nature. What he had done, with Stella's consistent, patient, relentless insistence, was learn to direct it. To be stubborn about the right things, about honesty and communication, and the daily work of being present, rather than about silence and pride and the fiction of handling everything alone. She had made him better. He told her that once, plainly, not as a grand declaration but as a simple statement of fact, while they were doing the dishes after supper one evening, James in bed and Clara asleep in the cradle. She dried her hands on the kitchen towel and looked at him. "You made yourself better," she said. "I just gave you a reason." "That is the most important thing anyone can do for another person," he said. She considered that. "Yes," she agreed, "I think it is." In 1891, Stella's consulting work expanded enough that she formalized it into a proper service arrangement with written contracts and a set rate, which she handled with the same organized, practical intelligence that characterized everything she did in business. The Agricultural Journal in Topeka had now published 4 of her pieces, and she had received a letter from a woman's farming collective in Wichita asking whether she would be willing to correspond with their members about her methods. She said yes, and began writing letters to 17 different women farming across central Kansas, letters that were practical and detailed and full of the specific, hard-won knowledge of someone who had done the work herself. The 60 acres produced its first significant apple harvest that fall, 6 years after she had planted the orchard. And she stood in the orchard on the golden October morning of the harvest with James beside her and Clara on her hip, and looked at the laden branches, and felt the deep satisfaction of something that had been a vision in a seed catalog coming true in the weight of fruit in her hand. Bo rode out to the 60 acres that afternoon to help with the harvest and found her in the orchard with Ruth and James, all 3 of them moving through the trees with baskets, and he stood at the orchard gate for a moment before they saw him, and he watched her and thought, "This is it. This is the life I almost did not fight for. This is what the county line was the beginning of." He looked at Stella across the basket of apples between them. She looked back, the serious, clear look she had, the one that saw everything. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I am thinking about 9 years ago," he said. She understood immediately. She always did. "October," she said. "October." She set down the apple she was holding and looked at him fully. "You know," she said, "I was planning to come back." He blinked. "What?" "I was not leaving permanently," she said. "I was going to Martha's sister's for a week to let myself think clearly. I was going to come back." He stared at her. "You were going to come back?" "I had 3 years of work in that soil," she said. "I was not going to abandon it over a man who could not find his words. I was going to come back and give you one more chance to say them. You never told me that. You never asked," she said. "And also, you did not give me the chance, because you came thundering over that ridge like the entire county was on fire, and you had that ridiculous cut on your jaw and your shirt was buttoned wrong. I dressed in a hurry." "I know," she said. "That was when I started thinking you might be worth the trouble," he laughed. It came out full and genuine, the way his laughter had become in these years of having someone to direct it toward, and she smiled in the full, warm way, and Clara stirred against his shoulder and settled back into sleep. And James said from somewhere in the next row of trees that he had found the biggest apple on the whole farm, and could he eat it? Stella called back that he could. The harvest was good. The year was good. In the spring of 1893, Stella discovered she was expecting their third child, and she told Beau in the orchard on the 60 acres, which had become, without either of them planning it, the place where they told each other the most important things. He took her hands and looked at her, and she was laughing a little quietly, because 3 children on a working ranch and farm operation was an ambitious undertaking, and they both knew it. "We manage," he said. "We do," she agreed. The third child, a boy they named Henry after Stella's brother, was born in October of 1893, arriving, as Beau noted with the satisfaction of a man who appreciates a good metaphor, in the same month and the same golden Kansas light as every significant thing that had ever happened in his life. Henry Calloway was loud and cheerful and immediately adored by James, who was 8 years old and took the responsibility of being an older brother with complete seriousness, and by Clara, who was 4 and who held the new baby with the same careful attention she brought to the herbs in the kitchen garden. The ranch and the farm continued to grow together in the way of 2 strong, independent things that are also deeply intertwined, each supporting the other without either losing what it was separately. Stella expanded the consulting operation through the decade, eventually training Ruth Carey to take on clients independently, which Ruth did with considerable skill, and which freed Stella to focus on the writing that had become an increasingly significant part of what she contributed to the broader conversation about farming on the plains. Beau continued to run the ranch with the same relentless competence, and the hard-won addition of the communication, and the honesty and the willingness to be wrong in front of the person he loved, which remained not entirely natural to him and which he continued to work at. He was, by the consensus of his hands and his neighbors and the town, a fair and reliable man, which was the reputation he most wanted, and which meant more to him than the cattle prices or the land value, both of which were also satisfactory. They grew old together in the way that people who have built something real together grow old, with the kind of ease that is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of a deep and practiced resilience in the face of it. There were hard seasons. There were years when the cattle prices dropped and the work was lean and the uncertainty was real. There were losses, people they loved, the natural end of things that could not be held. They moved through all of it with the same directness and honesty and the occasional necessary argument, and the afterward of the argument where they came back to each other, and rebuilt what the argument had tested, because they had learned, both of them, that the coming back was not weakness but the entire point. James Calloway grew into a man who ran the north portion of the ranch, with the same focused intensity he had brought to learning to ride at 5 years old, and who eventually married a young woman named Frances, who farmed on the adjacent property, and who had, in Stella's quiet assessment, exactly the right amount of stubbornness to handle a Calloway. Clara grew into a woman who became, as almost no one was surprised to discover, one of the more significant voices in the agricultural development of the county, carrying forward the work her mother had started and expanding it in ways Stella had not anticipated but which she recognized with deep satisfaction as the work going where it was always trying to go. Henry, the October baby, was the one who surprised everyone. He had his father's build and his mother's eyes, and an entirely self-generated passion for the law that nobody had seen coming, and that led him, after considerable study and considerable determination, to a career practicing law in Caldwell's Creek, and eventually representing the county in the state legislature, where he was known, the people who worked with him said, for being both absolutely direct and remarkably difficult to move once he had decided on something. Bo thought that was about right for a Callaway. On a Sunday evening in late October, in the year 1900, Bo Callaway sat on the porch of the ranch house with his wife of 16 years and looked out at the land in the last of the autumn light. The cottonwoods along the creek were gold, and the air had the particular cold clarity of Kansas in October, and somewhere inside the house, there was the sound of the grandchild James and Francis had produced the previous year, a boy named William, crawling at high speed toward something he should not reach. Stella was reading a letter from her brother Henry in Missouri, who was getting older and whose handwriting had begun to show it. She read with the same absorbed focus she brought to everything, and there was gray in her dark hair now, which Bo had never once thought of as anything other than evidence of the years they had spent together, and which he found, if anything, beautiful. He watched the land. He thought about the 46 years of his life, and the fact that 17 of them had been spent building something with the woman sitting next to him, and that those 17 years contained more of what he understood to be the actual substance of a life than everything that had come before them. She looked up from the letter and found him watching her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Everything." She considered that. "That is a better answer than you used to give. I have been practicing for 17 years. She folded the letter and set it in her lap and looked out at the land beside him. And the evening settled around them in the complete and golden way of evenings that are exactly what they should be on the Kansas plains in October, in the good light.